Hi, welcome to CHIRLA TV. I'm your host, Edgar Aguilar, and today we're going to be discussing a very important topic that is taking place here at our borders in the United States. The United States is going through one of the largest refugee crises on record. We have about 68.5 million people displaced around the world, including 25.4 million refugees. It is the largest number on record in recorded history, as a matter of fact. And to talk about that, we have two wonderful guests. I am joined by Anahita Panahi. She is the Southern California refugee organizer for the We Are All America campaign. Welcome, thank you for being here. And as well, we have our guest, Najeeba Syeed. She is a professor at the Claremont School of Theology. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here today.
So, we know this country is funded by immigrants, all this rhetoric that we had in the past of the support of immigration, but now we're seeing a change. So how is the We Are All America campaign involved in all of this?
Yeah, so again, my name is Heda Pinaki. I'm the Southern California refugee organizer with We're All America. And this campaign was introduced a couple years ago by the National Partnership for New Americans. We're locally partnered with CHIRLA, IRC, and CARLA. And so what we're really trying to do is advocate for refugees, asylum seekers, TPS holders, and all immigrant groups. So not only are we trying to create a more inclusive society for all these immigrants, but we're trying to beat unjust policies at the state level, at the national level, and hopefully just bring a more welcoming climate for all of our refugees and immigrants.
I see. In Najeeba, how are you involved in this movement?
So I'm a professor at Claremont School of Theology, and a lot of my students are faith leaders all over Los Angeles. There's pastors, priests that graduate from our school, and what we found is that faith leaders and people who are concerned about humanity are the ones that often worked with refugees. And so there's been a downshift in the number of refugees that are allowed to come to the United States. So you had a really important statistics. The national or international crisis is growing, but we're shutting our doors when we should be opening them. The door is getting smaller and smaller, and some would say arguably even non-existent for some communities.
So you mentioned that We Are All America is partnering with CHIRLA. How are you building the movement here in California, and especially in Southern California?
Right, so we're really trying to connect the refugees with the immigrants' right movement because they've kind of been neglected from this work. And when we think of immigrants, we usually think of asylum seekers at our southern border or undocumented folks. And so we really want to make sure that we include refugees with this work, not just that, and make sure that we're not stuck in these silos. So when we're stuck in these silos, we kind of segregate our different immigrant communities, and we want to make sure that we're building this inclusive society for all of us. So when I advocate for refugees, I'm advocating for asylum seekers, I'm advocating for TPS holders, undocumented folks. And so we really want to make sure that we're not segregating ourselves within these different immigrant groups.
I completely agree. And Najeeba, you as a professor, you have the opportunity to speak to students
Absolutely.
on a regular
Absolutely.
basis, right?
You know, I think one of the things we're seeing is the kind of rhetoric that is used to describe immigrant communities. It's out there now, and the language that's used is so dehumanizing. So I mean, it's hard to talk about, but we have to be really careful because the language that's used gets connected to the policies that are put in place. Right. And so when, as a society, we begin to see some people in the category of deserving of asylum and others as not deserving, we've undone years and years of humanitarian and legal precedents that the United States has stood on in opening doors to so many different communities. So I think as Anahita was speaking about it, and I was a part of an event that the organization put together, I was really struck by how when we come together, whether we are at the southern border of the United States or we're coming from a country where we're banned from traveling now to the United States under the Muslim ban or the refugee ban, there are so many common stories of trauma, of pain, and it only strengthens us if we have a conversation together. It also appeals to a much broader segment of this country who can see themselves in these stories.
In this event that you were part of, what was it about?
Yeah, so it was our first refugee advocacy event. It was called Beyond Borders and Seas because at the end of the day, like Najeeba was saying, we're really looking to be inclusive. So whether it's asylum seekers at the border or we have refugees coming from the Middle East or Africa. And so what we really intended to do was not only do outreach and talk about the different issues within the refugee community, but also learn about the different ways that we can organize and mobilize our communities and come out and just support one another. And so I think that it was very inclusive. We had a very diverse panelists, and I think from here on out, it's only going to get better, and we will be able to make more noise within the immigrant community.
Yeah, well, we'll be right back after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back to CHIRLA TV, the Immigrant Voice. I am here talking with our wonderful guests, Anahita and Najeeba, about the asylum seekers and immigrants throughout the United States. Najeeba, I wanted to touch base on a very peculiar subject. I myself, I'm an immigrant. I came from Mexico, and now I live here in the United States. But I've heard of a term, of forced migration. What is this?
So I think there are a lot of different terms, and it's important to make sure we understand what they mean. Mm-hmm. And so, for instance, the idea of forced migration is sort of groups of people or individuals who are persecuted at home and they're not able to stay in their home country because of some violence that's happening to them. It could also be caused by natural disaster. The causes are multiple. It doesn't have to be just one cause. But the idea is that you can't exist fully without a violation of your own capacity to either just essentially live safely. So when I was at the border recently and meeting with some refugees who were coming through waiting for asylum in Tijuana, a father was holding a young girl, and I thought it was his daughter, but he ended up saying, no, we're fleeing violence. 3 nights ago, this young girl's father was killed in the middle of the night. So that's really a forced migration. He's not coming to this, he wasn't coming to seek just better economic opportunity to send some money back home. He's literally unable to live in the city that he comes from because it's not a safe place for him. So I think it's really important that we utilize words like forced migration because it surfaces the stories of why people are fleeing. And, you see it, the way that the description of either it's, those that are coming from countries that are banned along the refugee ban. People are often coming from places like Syria, which in some ways the violence there is so high and they can't survive, and then America's then closed their doors on them. So it's just a heartbreaking situation. You're kind of, what do you do when your own country becomes a prison for you and you can't escape it? Yeah. And the avenues become less and less. It's really something to think about as the moral issue of our time.
Yeah, and I heard a couple of terms being used here, asylum seeker and refugee. Are they two different types of immigrants? What does this mean?
So they're often used interchangeably because they are the same, more or less the same. Refugees are fearing some sort of persecution, whether it be religious or political. There might be violence in their country. They could be fleeing some sort of natural disaster. So they apply for international refugee protection in their home country. The process is the application is accepted either by the government or UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency. They are vetted, very rigorously vetted, interviewed. It takes a few years before they're processed. And if they get accepted, then they will be sent to their destination country. An asylum seeker, on the other hand, may also be fleeing some sort of political or religious persecution, violence, natural disaster, or even development projects that fail, and they apply for asylum at a border or a port. Now, it's very important to note that applying for asylum at any border or port in the world is an international right, including in the United States. So what we see at our southern border right now of having refugees being sent back into Mexico, or having them being denied their due process is actually illegal. That's why we've seen this quote unquote humanitarian crisis at our border, because there isn't due process for these refugees applying for asylum. So at the end of the day, they're both leaving some sort of violence. They're fearing for their lives. The process of coming into the country is just different. And one last thing that I want to mention is that not all asylum seekers will be considered refugees. So some may be coming in for maybe trying to, as Najeeba mentioned, trying to maybe make some more money for their family, trying to send money back. If that is the case, they may not qualify for asylum protection. However, every single asylum seeker has the right to apply for asylum and to have their case heard.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for clearing up those terms. I know they've been used interchangeably, but now we have a clear definition of which one is which and what their rights are. So we'll be right back here at CHIRLA TV with Najeeba and with Anahita. Welcome back to CHIRLA TV. I am Edgar Aguilar. I'm joined by Anahita and Najeeba. Today we're talking about asylum seekers and refugees and what is taking place here at our borders in the United States. Anahita, we've seen some patterns going on, especially in our southern border. We have the so-called caravan, which is in reality an exodus. It's people fleeing Central American countries and coming through Mexico to the United States. But we also see people coming from overseas to other ports of entry. So can you share with us a little bit more of the interconnectedness of these patterns that we're seeing?
Right. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, we are facing the largest refugee crisis in history. I think two common things that we can speak on is that one, we're all humans, regardless of where we're coming from in the world. And two, whether you're a refugee and asylum seeker, you're seeking safe haven, you're seeking refuge in a different country. And the circumstances are unfortunate. Most of these folks don't want to leave their countries and they're forced to leave. So when we have refugees being banned from the Middle East coming into the country, or when we have the Trump administration putting a ban on asylum seekers coming into the country, what does that entail? That entails that we're criminals, that we're terrorists, that we're not human beings. So essentially this anti-immigrant rhetoric that's been going on is not only geared towards the Latinos or the Muslims or the Africans, it's become something that's been geared towards all immigrants, the minorities that are coming into our country. So it's really important that we don't dehumanize these individuals coming into our country and that we provide that safe haven for them, because essentially these are folks that are just trying to flee from their homes.
Whether it's immigrants who are trying to leave countries, war-torn countries, or those that are coming to the southern border also fleeing violence. Children and women disproportionately comprise the numbers of those that are seeking asylum, those that are affected by war. And I think that's a part of the story that has to be told. I think very often the conversation doesn't focus on how disproportionately women and children have to deal with the aftermath of violence, have to deal with losing very often family members in ways that affect their economic output, have to deal with the realities of as women and children, when you're traveling, what does that mean to be exposed to violence along the path of migration? And then, as we know, once they are often in custody, there were hundreds of complaints lodged by both women and children in the process of being housed in different parts of the United States under custody of the country. So I think very often that's a difficult conversation to have, whether there's shame attached to it, or very often the way the media represents the refugee and immigrant story, it does not include these conversations that engage women and children. And so I think more and more that's one of the connections, the realities of having to deal with violence in your home country and fleeing that violence. People are already coming with so much trauma So as we give care to refugees and immigrants, and particularly there's been a lot of there was a lot of activity done, a lot of us did activism to have things like domestic violence be recognized as a right for asylum. And this administration and policies in the last few years have really tried to even take away the protection with what we would call gender-based violence. So allowing for less protection or pushing less protection for women who are fleeing all forms of gender-based violence. So I just wanted to point that out because I do think that's a human story, but it's also a story around mothers and children that often isn't told in the media.
Yeah, you're completely right. We need to share this story. We need to let everybody know, whether it is through social media, which is a very accessible platform, to share those stories. We need to through the education or through the different campaigns that you're part of, organize people and be out there informing the community, making sure that these stories are told, they're not forgotten, and we stop dehumanizing asylum seekers, refugees, and immigrants overall, right? So we'll be right back here at CHIRLA TV, so stay tuned. Welcome back to CHIRLA TV. I'm your host, Edgar Aguilar. I'm joined by our wonderful guests, Anahita and Najeeba, talking about refugees and asylum seekers here in the United States. And something that I wanted to touch on is something that was mentioned earlier in the show, is the negative rhetoric that is being used by the current administration and how he has described not only their countries, but also the immigrants themselves in very negative language. In a lot of people are following, but how can we resist? How can we reply back? What can we do?
So there's quite a few things that we can do. One is demonstrating public support for refugees and refugee resettlement, and making sure that we hold the administration accountable for resettling at least the 75,000 that we've traditionally resettled in the past, and then also making sure that we meet our goal of 30,000 for fiscal year 2019. And it's very important that we educate elected officials, that we educate leaders within our community, and educate community in general. Education is key. And so how can we educate our community members? We can organize our community members and the impacted folks. So it's very important that we're able to empower and amplify the impacted individuals in our society, and making sure that their stories get heard. So we really humanize this whole the refugees, the immigrant community, and that we're not just statistics, we're not just numbers, that we're humans, and that we deserve a safe haven as well. So it's really our duty as people to educate others that are unaware of these unjust policies, so we're able to defeat these anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, anti-asylum policies that we have at the state, at the national level. And really the most important thing that we can do is just organize our communities, empower, educate. And hopefully with that at the grassroots level, we're able to get some wins at the state level and get some wins at the national level. And that's how we've seen the first couple Muslim American women in Congress. And I think that it starts from the ground up, and we're hopefully able to defeat this anti-immigrant rhetoric that we have in the media and that's been portrayed of immigrants.
Yeah, that's at the organizational level, grassroots, but also in schools.
Absolutely. I think one of the big factors that we need to look at is just becoming educated about the world, being educated about cultures and communities that don't look like me. Because a lot of times we get into a silo, not just of organizing, but information. So when there is a ban that keeps people from coming from places like Syria, what's happening in Syria? What's the cause of it? And I think that's really important, just public education on the causes for all of the many different forms of refugees and asylum seekers that are coming to the United States. I think that builds empathy, but it also helps us to understand that these patterns have been happening throughout history, and we can make a choice to build a country that's inclusive or we can build a choice to build a country that is going to push people out. And we think about World War II, there was an opportunity for America to be open to far more Jews that were escaping Nazi persecution. And America made some choices to turn away Jews who were trying to migrate to the United States. So I just point that out because this is not the first time that this country has had a choice to figure out which side of history it's going to be on. So empathy is built through conversations, but empathy is also built through understanding history, understanding what future we're building for our country, and to think about places like Los Angeles where immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers have strengthened this community economically. You know, what we would be without all those that are here. We have space for more, but more than that, this country, what makes America great is our diversity. And we have to really learn those stories, and we have to learn about how our country can get back on its moral imperative of being an open nation.
Yeah, well, if folks want to learn a little bit more about this, where can they go?
Yes, you can visit weareallusa.org, and CHIRLA, www.chirla.org.
Okay, so thank you so much, both of you, Anahita and Najeeba, for being part of the show. We would love to see you again in the near future. So thank you, everybody at home, for staying with us. We'll see you next time here at CHIRLA TV.